Section 14 of A Book of Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sophie Owen. A Book of Fairy Tales by Sabine Baring-Gould. Don't know. There was once upon a time a king whose wife, the queen, became mother in the palace of a little son called Dan. And at the same time, even to a minute, a mare in the stable had a little foal. Therefore the king gave the foal to his son Dan. When the young prince was old enough, he was sent to school, where he learned to read and write in cipher. Now not a single day passed, but before going to school he went into the paddock where was his foal, and talked to it, and patted it. Now it happened that war broke out, and the king was obliged to go to battle, and he entrusted his queen and boy to the care of a prime minister. Now the queen was a wicked woman, and she entered into a plot with the prime minister to seize on the reins of government and to establish herself sole sovereign in the land. But because the prince was very clever and observant, the prime minister had to be very cautious lest his plans should be found out. And as the prime minister schemed to get the king killed and then to marry the queen, he determined also to get rid of the crown prince. And in order to do this, he put a dagger in his bed with the point upwards, so that when Prince Dan went to bed, the dagger might pierce him through. Now the little prince went as usual into the paddock to stroke his little horse, and he saw it looked sad and woebegone. So he said to it, "Little horse, what ails you today?" But as the groom was by, the foal only hung his head and said nothing. Now when school was over, Prince Dan came back to see his little horse, and again he asked, "Little horse, what ails you today?" Then the foal said, "Nothing ails me, but the prime minister wants to kill you." Then he told the prince of the plan for his murder, and he told him what he was to do that night. So when darkness came on, Dan would not go to bed at all, but slept on the sofa. The prime minister saw he had failed in this scheme, but thought he would poison Dan with toffee, for of toffee the prince was passionately fond. Next day, as he went to school, he visited the foal, and the little horse said to him, "My king's son, be on your guard and take no toffee." And he told him the plan of the prime minister. When the prince came home, he was offered some delicious-looking toffee, but he refused to touch any. Then the prime minister saw that this scheme of his was unavailing. So he went to the queen, and he said to her, "Tidings have just arrived that the king is unexpectedly returning, and we are not yet prepared for his destruction. And I believe that Dan's foal tells him everything. Now, pretend to be very ill, and say that the doctors order you the heart of the foal as the sole thing that will set you on your feet again." Now very soon the king arrived, and was sorry to find the queen ill, and she told him all that the prime minister had put in her mouth. Then the king said, "Certainly I will have the foal killed, and you shall eat its heart. Only wait until Dan returns from school, that he may say good-bye to his little horse." Now the king walked to meet Dan as he came back from school, and told him that he must kill the foal. So Dan said, "Certainly, dear father, you must do what you see fit. Only first of all, let me pull on my riding breeches, and take my little whip, and gallop round the paddock once on my little horse's back." Then Dan ran to his foal, that looked sad and woebegone, and told it what his father had said, and what he had desired. The foal said to him, "Call for a glass of wine, and then drink to your father's health and the failure of your mother's and the prime minister's plans. Then jump on my back. I will carry you far away." He did so. When he had pulled on his riding breeches and taken his whip, he asked for a glass of wine, and kneeling before his father, said, "I drink to your health, father, and to the failure of my mother and the prime minister's plans, who have sought to dethrone you and to kill me." Then he jumped on his foal's back, and away he rode. Now when the king had heard those words, he wondered and examined into the matter, and then all came out. So he had the prime minister hung, and he put the queen in prison. In the meantime, the little horse had galloped away over land and sea, and never halted till it came to England and to the city of London. There at the outskirts it halted and said, "Now go into the town, but never speak any other word but 'don't know' to whatever is asked you till I give you leave." The prince promised this, and leaving his foal in a meadow outside London, he went alone into the great town. Those who met him asked him who he was, but he answered only, "Don't know." They inquired of what country he was. He replied only, "Don't know." They further asked his occupation. He said only, "Don't know." Now after a day or two it was told the king that there was a handsome lad going about London who could say no other words but "don't know." So he sent for him and asked him his name, and received the answer, "Don't know." "Very well," said the king, "be it so. You shall be called Don't Know." Then he sent him into the kitchen to be scullion there, but gave strict orders to the cook not to maltreat him in any way. Now it was usual for the servants to go to church on Sundays, and only one to remain at home and prepare dinner. When it came to be Prince Dan's turn to be alone in the kitchen, then he took ashes and strewed it all over the meat. When the cook came home, he was angry to see the good meat all spoiled. He said, "Why, what have you done this for?" Dan replied, "Don't know." "Do you know that you deserve a good hiding?" "Don't know." But as the king had ordered the lad was not to be maltreated, the cook did not dare to beat him, but he went to the king and begged that he might be taken out of the kitchen and put elsewhere. So the king placed him with the gardener. Now it was custom in the garden for the gardeners to go to church on Sunday, and one to remain behind to guard the garden. When it came to be Dan's turn to be at home, then his little horse came trotting up to him, and he brought him a bridle, and said, "Shake the bridle, and at once you will have a splendid horse to ride, and grand clothes to put on." So Dan shook the bridle, and immediately a chestnut horse stood before him with a red suit of clothes over the saddle, and all the accoutrements were of copper. Then Dan jumped on his back, and rode round and round the garden, till all the beds were trampled and spoiled. Then he leaped off the horse, which vanished along with the splendid red garments Dan had worn. Now it fell out that the king's third daughter, the youngest of his children, had not gone to church that day, as she had a bad cold. She had been looking out of the window, and saw all that had happened. When the gardeners came back from church, they were very angry, and they said to Dan, "Who's been here spoiling the flower beds?" "Don't know." "Why did you not keep proper guard?" "Don't know." "Were you asleep or awake?" "Don't know." "I hope," said the head gardener, "that you know one thing, which is that you deserve a hiding." "Don't know." It took a dozen men a whole week to put the garden in order again, and a month before any flowers grew in it. Then again it came to Dan's turn to remain at home while the rest went to church. The princess had told no one of what she had seen. Again she had a cold, and so she remained at home. And this is what she saw. No sooner were all at church, and Dan thought himself alone, than he went into the garden and shook the bridle, whereupon a white horse appeared with a white suit of clothes adorned with silver over the saddle. Dan drew on the suit, jumped into the saddle, and rode up and down the garden, trampling all the beds. When he was tired, he jumped off, and at once the horse and the white clothes disappeared. The princess had seen all this. When the gardeners came home and saw the mischief done, they were very angry, and they asked, "Why did you not keep proper guard?" "Don't know." "Who have been in the garden making this mess?" "Don't know." You may well believe that if the king had not given strict injunctions to the contrary, they would have beaten Prince Dan black and blue. Again the princess said nothing, and resolved on the same Sunday in the next month to pretend to be unwell, so as to stay at home and see what would happen. Now when the Sunday came, when it was Dan's turn to keep guard, the princess remained in the palace. This time she opened her window and leaned forth to see the better. Dan shook the bridle, and immediately a yellow horse appeared, and over the saddle was a dress of cream colour, all woven with gold thread. He jumped into the saddle, and rode up and down and around the garden, and when he came near an open window, where was the princess, then he leaped on the saddle, and kissed her on the mouth. Now when he had ridden sufficiently, he dismounted, and instantly horse and garments vanished. When the gardeners returned, they were furious. "Who has been here? They're a horse hoof prince." "Don't know." "How is it you don't know? Did you keep your eyes shut?" "Don't know." Well, the king thought it was high time to have his 3 daughters married, so he had them advertised in all the daily papers. Wanted, 3 desirable husbands for 3 eligible princesses, must be of royal blood, good-looking, cleanly in their habits, and not given to chewing or smoking or snuffing tobacco. Apply, Buckingham Palace. N.B. No postcards. The king was very amiable, and he said to his daughters, "My dears, I positively don't want to force any undesirable husbands on you. I give you free liberty to pick and choose and take whomsoever you like." "Any one, revered father?" asked the youngest. "Is not royal descent a sine qua non?" "So long as he is cleanly in his habits and person, and doesn't chew, snuff, or smoke, I will not insist on that requirement," said the king. Troops of princes came to London, all aspirants after the hands of the princesses, and every one was scrupulously clean, and none were devoted to tobacco. The king had them all trotted out in the yard before his daughters, and the eldest chose her husband, and then the second the same, both desirable princes. But the youngest did not find any to her mind, so she said to the king, "Father, may I have one of the court?" "By all means, if cleanly in his habits, and not addicted to the filthy habit of snuffing, chewing, or smoking tobacco." "Will you have them all up?" asked the princess. So all the court was brought forth and marched in the front yard of the palace before the princess, but not one pleased her. Then she said, "Is every member of the court here?" "All but that miserable don't know," said the head gardener. "Send for Don't Know," asked the princess, and the Prince Dan arrived. Then she went straight up to him and kissed him on the mouth, and said, "That's the boy for me." Now when the sisters and the princes, who were to be their husbands, saw and heard this, they were greatly shocked and offended. However, the king was so good-natured, and his youngest daughter so persistent, that there was no help for it, and the 3 princesses were married the same day. But as the 2 eldest sisters and their prince were extremely disgusted at the youngest sister's choice, and as they represented that it was not proper for them to live in the palace, the king had the potato house cleared out, in which the potatoes were usually kept through the winter, and fitted up as the house of Don't Know and his wife. Now one day, soon after the wedding, there was to be a hunt. So the 2 princes, as they rode out to the chase, passed the potato house and saw Don't Know outside. They laughed and said, "Brother-in-law, are you coming out for some sport today?" "Don't know." "We suppose you never rode a horse in your life?" "Don't know." "Nor killed any game?" "Don't know." So away they went, laughing to each other about this silly brother-in-law of theirs. Now when they were gone, Dan shook his bridle, and at once the red horse appeared, and the red and copper garment. He put it on and mounted, and away he went after his brothers-in-law. As he approached them, they did not know him, and they said to one another, "Who is this great prince who rides this way?" They waited until he came up, and then asked if he would join them. Now the horse had given him leave to speak whilst in his gay garments, so he answered and said, "I have already chased." "What have you caught?" He held out a golden pheasant. Then the princes longed to be able to take this home with them and show it as their capture, so they begged him to give them the pheasant. He said he would do so if they would give him the rings off their fingers. To this they consented. They gave him their rings, and he gave them the golden pheasant, and rode away, and got fast home, jumped off the red horse, and stood by the door of the potato house when they came home. As they drew nigh, the princes showed the golden pheasant, and shouted, "Brother-in-law, do you not admire our skill in the chase?" "Don't know," was all he answered. Next day there was to be another chase in the forest. The princes rode by the potato house, and said, "Brother-in-law, will you come out with us today?" "Don't know." But when they were gone, he shook the bridle, and immediately the white horse appeared, with the white suit of raiment adorned with silver. He mounted, and rode after his brothers-in-law. They had been unsuccessful that day, and were discouraged. They said, "Here comes that prince again, in most splendid raiment, and on a magnificent horse. Who can he be?" When Dan came up, they saluted him respectfully, and asked if he would have sport with them that day. He replied that he had already been engaged in the chase, and had got a beautiful white swan. They were very desirous to have this, but he said he would take no money for it, only if they would allow him to heat their rings red hot, and stamp the signets on their heads under the hair, then would he give up the snowy swan. They thought no one would see if branded under the hair, so they consented. He branded them both with their own seals, gave them up the swan, and galloped home. The horse and his white vesture disappeared, and as they came home they saw him lounging at the door of the potato house. They held up the beautiful swan, and said, "See, brother-in-law, what luck we have! Don't you wish you were as clever as we?" "Don't know." "Ah, but you know you are a fool, and we are wise." "Don't know." They rode into the palace laughing, and got great credit for having killed the swan. Next day there was another hunting party. Again the princes laughingly taunted Dan. "Will you come a-hunting, brother-in-law?" "Don't know." "You haven't got a horse to ride, we suppose?" "Don't know." "Nor bows and arrows?" "Don't know." "But you know you are a fool." "Don't know." When they were out of sight, he shook the bridle, and now a gold-yellow horse stood before him, and a splendid crocus-yellow garment woven with gold thread. He put on the dress, mounted, and galloped after the princes. When he drew near, they said to one another, "Can this be the same prince we have seen twice before?" They waited till he came up, and then saluted him with the profoundest respect, and inquired if that he would hunt with them that day. He replied that he had already done his hunting, and he showed them a gold fawn that he had killed. When the princes saw this, they were mad set to have the fawn, and they begged him to let them have it. But he said he would give it up only on condition that they each allowed him to brand them on the back with something. Well, they were so set on having the gold fawn that they agreed, and he burned on their backs the symbol of a pair of gallows. Then he rode home, and had changed everything before they arrived, and when they came, they bragged about their hunting and showed the gold fawn they had killed. "You couldn't do this, could you, brother-in-law?" they asked. He only replied from the door of the potato shed, "Don't know." Now it happened that the great King Cuckoo of Ireland, who had been subject to the King of England, was so set on being independent, and even of subjugating England, that he gathered a great army, and came over and marched against London. The king sent out an army to oppose his advance under one of his sons-in-law, but it was defeated. Then he sent out another under the second, and that was defeated also. So now the king gathered together all the remnant of his forces and determined to take the field in person. He would command the centre and each of his son-in-laws the wings. The two princes went to the potato shed and said, "Come on, brother-in-law, the land is in danger. You must fight as well as we." "Don't know," answered Dan. "Don't you know how to handle bow or spear?" "Don't know." "If we are defeated again, all will be up with every one of us," said the princes. "Don't know," answered Dan. Now as soon as they had marched out of London, Dan shook the bridle, whereupon his own little horse came trotting up to him, and he had on his back 3 portmanteaus. He said to his master, "See, take these portmanteaus. In one is an army of soldiers, in another are munitions of war, in the third is plenty of money. The day is going against the king. Quick, put on the suit of armour you see provided, jump on my back, and ride to the rescue of your father-in-law, but first unpack the portmanteaus." So Dan immediately opened the leather boxes, and when he had opened the first, out marched an army of men, and when he had opened the second, out rolled cannons and cannonballs, and hay for the horses and food for the men. And when he had opened the third, he found in it gold, wherewith to pay the soldiers, and gold is said to be the sinews of war. So he mounted his little horse, and rode at the head of his army to the battlefield, and he arrived just as the centre was giving way, and when the 2 wings were turning to flight. He rushed forward with his men, and fell on King Cuckoo with his Irish, and utterly routed them, and took their banner, on which was inscribed "Home Rule Forever," and sent the Irish flying, tumbling, head over heels, away, away, as fast as their legs could run, in the direction of their native isle. Now as soon as he had gained the victory, he hastily withdrew with all his men till he had got behind a belt of trees. Then he packed all his troops once more into their portmanteau, and put in all the munitions of war into the second, and returned as quickly as he could to London, jumped off his little horse, and stood lounging at the door of his potato shed when the king and the princes and the army returned, playing and singing and whistling and dancing, "Rule Britannia, Britannia, rule the waves. Britons never, never, never will be slaves," least of all to Paddy. And as the princes passed by the door where stood Dan, "Aha, brother-in-law," they said, "where were you today when we gained the victory over King Cuckoo?" "Don't know." "What would you have done had you been in battle? Run away, of course." "Don't know." "And where would you be now, but for our victorious arms?" "Don't know." A grand banquet was given that evening, and much wine was drunk, and toasts were proposed, and the 2 princes bragged of what they had done, and no one said a word about the mysterious assistance that had been given just as fortune had declared against the English arms. But presently the king got up on his feet, and at once everyone began to hammer on the table and say, "Hear, hear!" Then the king said, "Ladies and gentlemen, princes and princesses of the blood royal, duke and marquesses and earls and viscounts and barons and baronets and knights and squires, and all in your several degrees, I hope you will listen to the few words I venture to utter. Hear, hear!" And one of the princes thundered out, "Encore!" "I have listened," said the king, "with surprise, and I am fain to admit sorrow, and heard everyone present boasting about his great deeds, and no one saying a word about that gallant and most mysterious hero who seemed to drop from the clouds, and without whom we should have been compelled to cut and run." "No, no, no, no! Yes, I repeat it," said the king. "The wings under the masterly direction of my son-in-laws had received the order right about face, cut! The centre under my august self was giving way. No, 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 no! It is of no use shutting our eyes to facts," pursued his majesty. "We should have been jolly well licked." He paused. The expression was hardly diplomatic. He corrected it to, "We should have met with a serious reverse, but for the assistance of our mysterious ally. I drink, gentlemen and ladies, princes of the blood royal, dukes, etc., to the very good health of our deliverer this day. By the way," added the king, sitting down, "where is son-in-law number 3? Every one of the guests looked in everyone else's face and said, "Don't know." And the servants behind the guests looked about the grand banqueting hall, and they also said, "Your most gracious majesty, don't know." And the footman on the stairs looked up and down the staircase, and the porter at the gate looked at them, and they at him, and said, "Don't know." Just then was heard martial music. A magnificent band was heard playing, and the tune that was being played was, "See the conquering hero comes." And presently large bodies of soldiers appeared, infantry and cavalry, in magnificent uniform, and surrounded the palace, and then, riding on a golden-coloured horse in golden armour, with a white horse at his side, on which rode a lady in cloth of silver, came a prince. He was attended by a number of equerries and staff officers, and he descended from his horse at the palace gates, gave his hand to the princess, let her alight, and then strode up to the gates. The porter said, "Your name, sir?" "Don't know." Then the porter, who had quite lost his head at all the magnificence, said to the first footman, "His Serene Highness don't know." And the first footman shouted to the second, "His Highness don't know." And the second shouted to the third with great emphasis, "His August High and Mightiness don't know." And so the announcement ran up the stairs, but with a few strides the newcomer reached the top of the grand state stairs, and the princess with him, and they walked into the banqueting hall, and lo! everyone stood up and cheered, for they recognised the conqueror in that day's battle. Then Prince Dan, for it was he, bowed his knee to the king, and said, "Sire and father-in-law, I am the youth who has for all this while answered to every question asked me, 'Don't know.' Now I am released by my little horse from the necessity of making this answer. Why imposed on me, goodness only knows, but I made the promise, and a promise, sire and father-in-law, is, I need hardly say, a promise, and must be kept. I am of royal blood, being the son of the very puissant king of Cloudland. I came here, and here your youngest daughter chose me to be her husband. Your two other princes, son-in-laws, are humbugs. Here are their rings, and I took from them. If you will lift up their hair, you will see them branded with their own signets. If you will strip their coats off their backs, you will find them marked with a pair of gallows between their shoulder blades. If you have the least doubt, sire and father-in-law, that it is I who assisted in this glorious day, here is your own pocket-handkerchief which you gave me. In the midst of the fray, I was slightly wounded in the arm. When you saw the blood flow, you pulled out your red silk pocket-handkerchief and insisted on binding it about my arm. I restore it to you. I am healed. The kingdom of Great Britain is henceforth safe from the humiliation of annexation through subjugation to the neighbouring isle." There was immense applause, and even the humble princes, the brothers-in-law, had sufficient grace to say, "Encore, encore." Then the king said, "It is obvious to me and all that I must make this victorious hero heir to my throne, though he has married only my youngest daughter. Hitherto we have only known him by the name of Don't Know. We would all like to know what is the real name by which he may be known in history." Now the writer of this story is fain to say that at this point his authorities fail him. In Cloudland the prince was indeed called Dan, but not so in English history. If therefore it be asked by what name this prince may be looked for in the catalogue of English sovereigns, he is obliged to admit, "Don't know." Don't Know is a Hungarian folk tale from the collection of George Gile, translated by Steer, Peths, N.D. The affinity of sympathy between the prince and his horse is not an uncommon feature in such tales. The story of the service to the King of England, and of the mysterious horses on which the prince rides to hunt and to deliver the king from his foes, occurs also in the far older tale of Robert the Devil, which can be traced back to the early Middle Ages, and to which indeed William the Conqueror is said to have alluded before the Battle of Hastings in his address to his soldiers. End of section 14. Recording by Sophie Owen.
Section 15 of A Book of Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Betty B. A Book of Fairy Tales by Sabine Baring-Gould. Miranda, or the Royal Ram. Once upon a time there lived a king who had 3 beautiful daughters, the youngest of whom, named Miranda, was the most amiable and was her father's favourite. The king was very superstitious and had great faith in dreams. One day he asked his daughters to tell him the subject of their dreams the foregoing night. The eldest said that she had dreamed that he gave her a gown, the gold and jewels of which shone bright as the sun and stars. The second said that she had dreamed that he gave her a golden distaff and spinning wheel for her to spin linen. The third said that she had dreamed that her father came to her and held a golden basin with water in it, and had said to her, "Come and wash your hands." The king was very angry with Miranda for her dream, and he thought that it could have but one signification, that she would dethrone him, make herself queen, and turn him into her servant. As he was a very suspicious and jealous man, as well as superstitious, he worked himself to such a pitch of unrest over this thought that all his love was changed to dislike and fear took the place of regard. He determined to have his once darling daughter put to death, so as to bring this dream of hers to naught. For this purpose he commanded the captain of his guard to carry Miranda into the forest and kill her, and that he might be sure of its being done, he ordered the officer to bring her heart and tongue to the palace, threatening him with instant death should he disobey his orders. The captain, with much sorrow, went at an early hour to the princess's apartment, and told her that the king had sent for her. She arose immediately and followed him, accompanied by a little Moor called Patipata, who held up her train, also by a young ape called Grabugeon, and by a little dog called Tintin, which ran by her side. Not finding the king in the garden, where the captain said he was taking fresh air, she was advised to seek him in the forest, whither it was said he had gone to see the does and deer. She resolved on following him thither. But as they went on the sun rose, and the princess saw it sparkle in the tears that ran down the cheeks of her conductor. She gently asked him the cause of his sorrow. "Alas, madam," he said, "how can I be otherwise than sad at heart? The king has ordered me to kill you, and to carry your heart and tongue to him, and if I do not do this, he will put me to a cruel death." The innocent princess became pale when she heard this, and said to the captain, "Are you hard-hearted enough to kill one who has never injured you, but has ever spoken in your favour to the king?" "Do not fear, princess," he answered. "I will sooner suffer death myself than hurt a hair of your head. But is it possible for us to find out some method of persuading the king that you are dead?" "What way can we discover?" asked Miranda, "since he will not be satisfied unless he sees my tongue and my heart." At these words the little Moor, who was warmly attached to her mistress, came and threw herself at Miranda's feet, and said, "Dear madam, let me be the sacrifice. I shall be but too happy to die for your preservation." "No," said the princess, kissing her, "your life ought now to be as dear to me as my own." The young ape, Grabugeon, next advanced and said, "Truly, princess, your slave, Patipata, is likely to be more serviceable to you than I can be. Therefore I offer you my heart and tongue willingly." "Oh, my dear Grabugeon," replied Miranda, "I cannot bear the thought of taking your life away." Her faithful dog Tintin then cried out that he could not bear the thought of any one but himself dying for his beloved mistress. In short, after a long dispute between Patipata, Grabugeon, and Tintin, which of them should suffer death instead of the princess, Grabugeon nimbly climbed to the top of a tree, and throwing himself down, broke his neck. The captain, with much persuasion, got leave of the princess to cut out his tongue, but it proved too small to serve to deceive the king with it. "Alas, my poor ape!" exclaimed the princess, "thou hast lost thy life without doing me any service." "That honour," interposed the Moor, "is reserved for me," and she instantly ran upon the knife wherewith the captain had cut out Grabugeon's tongue. But here also the intended service failed, as the poor Moor's tongue was too black to pass for Amanda's. The princess, bursting into tears and lamentations for the loss of the Moor and of the ape, her dog Tintin exclaimed, "If you had accepted my offer, there would have been none to regret but myself, and real service would have been done you." Miranda was so overwhelmed with grief that she fainted away, and when she came to herself, the captain was gone, and the little dog was lying dead beside the ape and the Moor. Having buried her three favourites in a hole under a tree, she began to think what she must do for herself. As the forest was not far from her father's court, and she might easily have been discovered, and so bring destruction not only on herself but also on the captain, she travelled as fast as she could walk, though in an opposite direction, till at last she was almost ready to expire with weariness. Then, hearing the bleating of sheep, she supposed that she was approaching some shepherds with their flocks, and she exerted all her remaining strength to reach the place, in hopes of finding some relief. But how great was her surprise when she came to a spacious plain, to see a large ram as white as snow, with gilded horns, and a garland of flowers about his neck, lying on a bed of orange blossom, and shaded from the sun by a tent of cloth of gold. 100 sheep richly adorned were in attendance on him. Miranda became motionless with astonishment, and looked about for the shepherd of so extraordinary a flock, when the noble ram approached her and said, "Draw near, lovely princess, and be not afraid of such gentle creatures as are we." "What!" exclaimed the princess, starting back. "Is it possible that you can speak?" "Why not, madam?" answered the ram. "When your dog and your ape spoke, they did it because endowed with the gift by a fairy. May not the same be the case with me? Be not surprised, but tell me what has brought you here." "1,000 misfortunes," answered Miranda. "I am forced to fly from the rage of a cruel father." "Come then with me, madam," said the ram, "and I will conduct you to a place where you will be secure from discovery, and be treated with the utmost respect." The ram then ordered his chariot, which was large enough to hold 2 persons with ease, and was lined with blue velvet, and drawn by 6 cashmere goats. The princess placed herself in it, and the ram got in after her, and drove to the mouth of a cave, which, though stopped by a large stone, was opened when the ram touched it with his foot. Miranda, having descended numerous marble steps, was exceedingly surprised to find herself in a strange country, in a plain enamelled with flowers, where played fountains of fragrant essences. Here and there clumps of trees formed a habitation for birds, and when Miranda passed, they flew out in the form of tartlets, cheesecakes, sponge cakes, and biscuits, all supplied with wings. The princely ram told Miranda that he had reigned here for several years, and had sufficient cause for grief. He required but little persuasion to tell his sad story. "Born and educated as a prince," said he, "I came into possession of one of the most delightful kingdoms in the world, and I was much beloved by my subjects and respected by foreigners. Being fond of hunting, as I was one day pursuing a stag, he took me to a pond, into which I imprudently plunged my horse after him. Instead of finding the water cold, I found it to be extremely hot, and the pond dried up all of a sudden, and there shot out of a hole in the earth a terrible fire. Then the bottom of the pond sank, and I went down a long way till I reached the bottom of a sort of well, with flames all around me. Then I saw an old hag before me, who said, 'Fiercer flames than these are needed to warm thy heart.' 'Alas,' said I, 'who complains of my coldness?' 'I do, I, an unfortunate wretch who adores you without hope.' Then the fire disappeared, and I knew now that this old woman was a terribly powerful fairy. 'What, Regatta,' said I, 'was this done by your orders?' 'By whose else, think you?' she answered. 'Have you not known for a long time that I have loved you? Consider how low I stoop, I, a fairy, to desire the affection of a man such as you.' 'You ask what I cannot give you,' I answered. 'Neither do you go the right way to work to win my love.' 'What do you object to in me?' asked the fairy. 'In the first place, you are old.' 'Old!' she exclaimed. 'I can transform myself and make myself young and beautiful.' 'And you have a moustache,' said I. 'That I can pluck out,' she answered. 'And one eye is looking in one direction, the second eye in another.' 'I can put one of them out,' she said. 'In a word,' said I can never love you.' In a rage she struck me with her wand and said, 'You shall feel my resentment. Be a ram, and continue so, till some king will suffer you to sit on his throne and drink out of his cup.' I found myself at once changed into my present shape, and my courtiers were turned into sheep. Miranda was struck by so remarkable a story. She paid the ram some civilities, but she could not encourage him with hope of regaining his form, for it seemed to her impossible to believe that any king would suffer a ram to ascend his throne and drink out of his cup. Miranda remained for some time in the beautiful land to which the royal ram had conducted her. At last news reached her that her eldest sister was going to marry a great prince, and that extensive preparations were being made for the nuptials. These tidings were brought her by a swallow. Miranda asked the ram's leave to go to her sister's wedding, and this was granted, but the ram insisted on her going in most magnificent apparel. She arrived at the king's court just as the marriage of her sister was about to take place. When Miranda arrived, her appearance caused a general flutter of astonishment and admiration, as she was dressed in shining silver tissue set with pearls, and no one had ever seen so magnificent a dress. And indeed she was so lovely that many, the gentlemen especially, looked only at her face, whilst the ladies examined, admired, and were jealous of her gown. The king especially observed her with great attention. When Miranda saw this, she became alarmed lest he should give orders to have her stopped, so she stole away before the ceremony was concluded, and hastened back to the realm of the royal ram. The ram had been waiting with the utmost impatience for the return of Miranda, and as soon as he saw her, he ran towards her, and gave many tokens of passionate fondness for her. So Miranda remained again some time in the pleasant realm of the royal ram. Then it fell out that a swallow came and twittered in her ear, and told her that the king was about to give his second daughter in marriage to a great prince. Miranda begged leave to attend this wedding also. The ram could not refuse, and he insisted that she should wear a still more splendid dress, all of cloth of gold with diamonds woven into it, and a crown of gold and diamonds on her head, and also he made fast a diamond to every single hair of her head, and also to each of her eyelash hairs and to those that formed her brows. Thus she twinkled and blazed with splendor. As soon as Miranda had arrived at her father's court, the king at once ordered all the gates to be closed. When the ceremony was over, he went up to her and begged leave to escort her to the banqueting hall. Miranda would have fled, but found all the doors fast. Then the king led her into the hall, and hasted and brought a golden basin with water for her to wash her hands in. Miranda immediately fell at his feet, saying, "Sire, behold, my dream is fulfilled. I am your third daughter, and you have offered me water in a golden basin." When the king heard this, he recollected the features of his daughter Miranda, and was filled with shame and sorrow. He cried out, "Oh, my dear daughter, forgive the cruelty of a father who deserves death for the way in which he treated you. Now what can I do to make amends for my past injustice?" "Sire," answered Miranda, "grant me a single favour." "I will grant you anything you ask," answered the king. "Sire," said she, "suffer a ram to sit on thy throne and to drink out of thy cup." When the king heard this, he was much astonished and became red in the face, and did not know what answer to make. Nevertheless, because he had made the promise before all the court and all the friends and visitors from foreign kingdoms who had come to the wedding, he gave his consent. It must be told that the ram waited and became impatient because Miranda did not return. So at last, having lost all patience, he resolved to venture to the court, where he asked admittance, but was refused by the guards at the gates. However, Miranda, having received the king's promise, went down, and when the gates were open, then she saw the ram outside. Full of joy inexpressible, she conducted him into the throne room, and herself carried him up the steps and seated him in the throne. Then she ran and fetched wine in the king's own cup and offered it to him. No sooner had the ram drunk out of the royal cup, seated in the royal throne, than the spell that had been cast over him came to an end, and he was changed back into his original form, a beautiful prince, and immediately, with immense rejoicings, was married to Miranda. Notes: Miranda, or the Royal Ram. A tale by Madame d'Aulnoy. The story became a favourite for issue in chapbook form in England. It is a variant of Beauty and the Beast, and is without any distinguishing merit. End of section 15.
Section 16 of A Book of Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. recording by Kate Follis. A Book of Fairy Tales by Sabine Baring-Gould. Bluebeard. There lived once on a time a man who had very fine town houses and also country residences, magnificent plate, furniture in the latest style, gilded coaches, and a cook who sent him up every day a dinner of 6 courses, every day different from what had been. Unfortunately for him, he had a blue beard. This made him so hideous and frightful that there was not a woman or girl who did not run away when he appeared. One of his neighbours, a lady of quality, but very poor, had 2 daughters of the most amiable dispositions, and both very lovely. The man with the blue beard asked for one in marriage, and left the choice to their mother. Neither would hear of taking him because of his blue beard. Moreover, it was commonly reported that he had had several wives, and no one could say exactly what had become of them. Bluebeard invited the lady with her daughters to visit him in one of his country places. He at the same time asked many of the neighbours there, and he gave entertainments in succession for a week. There was one uninterrupted series of dances and picnics, of hunting parties, of dinners. There was really no time for sleep. There was such splendour displayed in the house, such fertility of resource in the master for their amusement, that the company present thought they never had enjoyed themselves more, and that after all, if the owner of the place and the giver of the festivities had a blue beard, he had wealth enough to gild it, and that a good deal might be forgiven a man who had such plate, such a cook, such furniture, and who dearly loved giving parties. The youngest of the lady's daughters considered that it would be a very pleasant thing to be mistress of so grand an establishment, and to be looked up to by all the neighbourhood as the person of most consequence therein. She felt her aversion for Bluebeard decrease, and finally consented to accept him. The entertainments were now prolonged for another week, at the end of which time a magnificent wedding took place, to the great satisfaction of the young lady's mother, who thought she had disposed of her daughter to the greatest possible advantage. At the end of a month, Bluebeard told his wife that business required him to absent himself for 6 weeks or a month, and he begged her to amuse herself as best she could during his absence. She was to invite her friends to visit her, and to entertain them. "Here," said he, "are the keys of 2 large linen chests. Here are those of my plate chest. Here are those of my money boxes, and also of all my jewels. And here is a key that opens all the doors and cupboards throughout the house. You see this little key? That pertains to the cabinet at the end of the long picture gallery. You may open any closet and cupboard and chamber throughout my house, with the single exception of that little cabinet. I strictly forbid you to enter or look in there under pain of my extreme displeasure, and of forfeiting all my love for you, and all your happiness for the future." She promised exactly to observe all that he commanded, and after he had warmly embraced her, he mounted his equipage and drove away. The neighbours and friends did not wait to be invited to come to the country house, and to relieve the dullness of the young bride, and they were extremely desirous of being shown everything in the house, and of turning out all the cupboards, a thing they had never before ventured to do. They had not even asked to be allowed to do, so great was their dread of Bluebeard. Now, however, that he was away, They scattered through the house, they ran upstairs and down, they pried into every chamber, they explored every cupboard and searched every drawer. They examined all the furniture, they went through all the house linen, they examined and admired the tapestries, the carpets, the curtains, the coverlets. Then they looked through all the plate to make sure that it was of real silver and gold and not plated wares. They turned over all the books in the library. They tried on all the family jewels. They even examined all the bottles of preserved fruit and pots of crystallized ginger in the storeroom. The mistress of the house took little pleasure in seeing and showing all these treasures to her friends, for she was most inquisitive to know what there was in the cabinet at the end of the picture gallery. Indeed, so impatient was she to satisfy her curiosity that she deserted her guests, and when they were all engaged elsewhere, she slipped into the gallery by herself and put the key into the door which she had been forbidden to open. She paused there for one moment, with a little hesitation, because she remembered her husband's threats, but her curiosity overcame all scruple of disobeying him and fears for herself, and she tremblingly opened the door of the cabinet. At first she saw nothing, for the windows were all shut, but after a while her eyes became accustomed to the gloom, and she saw that the floor was all stained with blood, and that along the walls hung the dead bodies of a great many young women. These were the wives Bluebeard had married in succession, and had put to death one after the other. She thought she would have died of horror, and the key which she had withdrawn from the door dropped from her hand. After a while she recovered her senses, picked up the key, fastened the door, and hastened to her bedroom to throw herself on a couch and compose her mind. But she could find no rest, so violent was her agitation, and she begged her sister, who was called Anne, to dismiss her guests on the plea that she was ill and could not entertain them further. When alone, the young wife noticed that there was a stain of blood on the key. She at once tried to wash it off, but neither soap nor water would remove it. Then she rubbed the key with sandpaper, but this was equally in vain. If she rubbed out the stain of blood on one side, it broke out on the other side of the key. Bluebeard returned from his travels that same evening. He said that he had received letters whilst on his journey, which informed him that the business on which he had started had come to a satisfactory termination, and that his presence was no longer needed. His wife did all that she could to show him that she was delighted at his return, but she called to her a little foot-page and said, "Run, run as fast as your feet will bear you to my home. My 2 brothers are there, just returned from the wars. Bid them ride and spur and never slack rein till they have reached this place and saved me." Next morning Bluebeard asked for his keys, and his wife restored them to him with a hand that trembled, so that he suspected what had happened. He looked at the keys and said, "I miss that of my cabinet. Where is that?" "I must have left it upstairs," she said. "Do not fail to bring it me," he said in a stern voice. There was no help for it. She was obliged to produce the key. Bluebeard looked at it with a frown. "Why is there blood on this key?" he asked. She was too frightened to answer. "You have been in the cabinet, which I forbade you to open and enter. Very well, madam. You shall go in again, and this time remain there, hung to the wall beside the other ladies you saw there." She threw herself at her husband's feet, weeping and entreating pardon with all the marks of sincere repentance for her disobedience. So beautiful and distressed was she that she might have melted a heart of stone, but that of Bluebeard was harder than stone. "You must die, madam," said he, "and that instantly." "If I must die," she replied, looking at him with eyes bathed in tears, "give me at least time to say my prayers." "Very well," he answered. "I grant you 1/4 of an hour, not a moment longer." When she was alone, she summoned her sister and said to her, "Sister Anne, I pray you, mount the tower and see if my brothers are coming. I sent them word to come without delay. When you see them, sign to them to speed their fastest." Her sister immediately ascended to the battlements of the tower and looked away in the direction of her home. The poor trembling and weeping bride called to her after a few minutes, Sister Anne, is there anyone coming?" "I see nothing," answered her sister, "but the sun's beams glancing, and the motes dancing, and the grass is green and growing. Oh!" Bluebeard, in the meanwhile, had got a great cutlass from the armoury, and he called to his wife, come down, or I'll draw you by the golden locks of your crown." "Grant me 1 moment longer," answered his wife. She cried again to her sister, Sister Anne, is there any one coming?" "I see nothing," answered her sister, "but the sun's beams glancing, and the motes dancing, and the grass is green and growing. Oh!" Come down this very moment," shouted Bluebeard. "Time is up. Come down, or I'll draw you by the golden locks of your crown." "I am coming directly. Suffer me to pull on my shoe," said the unhappy wife. Then again she called to her sister, Sister Anne, do you see any one coming?" "I see," said the sister. "I see a cloud of dust springing, and I hear harness ringing, and the grass is green and growing. Oh!" Then Bluebeard roared forth, "If you do not come down at once, I shall come up and fetch you." But his wife said, "Suffer me to pull on the other shoe, and then I will come down." And now again she called, Sister Anne, is there any one coming?" Sister Anne replied, "I see armour glancing, and 2 horses prancing, and your brothers ride fast to the castle. Oh!" Bluebeard would not tarry any longer, and his wife could find no further excuse for delaying to come down. So she slowly and tremblingly descended the stairs. With hair dishevelled, and with her face bathed in tears, she threw herself on her knees and begged him to spare her life. "It is of no avail," answered Bluebeard. "Die you must and shall." Seizing her by the hair, her golden hair, with one hand, and brandishing the cutlass with the other, he prepared to strike the fatal blow. Stay," she said. "I have on my neck the beautiful chain you gave me." "Take it off, lest it turn the edge of my sword," said he. She obeyed with fingers that shook as if she had the palsy. Again he raised the cutlass above her head. Stay," she said. "I'm wearing my white bridal silken dress, and it will be all dappled and stained with my heart's blood." "Take it off," he said. She obeyed slowly, so great was her fear. Then she knelt down again, and again he raised the cutlass to strike off her head, when she cried out, Stay! The parrot is in the window, and he will talk and tell how you have killed me." "That is true," said Bluebeard, and he removed the cage and put it in another room. Then he came back and raised the cutlass and said, "I will not be put off again." But at that moment a loud knocking was heard at the gates, which made Bluebeard pause. The gates were burst open, and 2 young men in shining steel armor, with their swords drawn, rushed in. They flew upon Bluebeard and pursued him as he attempted to escape. They overtook him before he had mounted the platform on top of the castle, and ran him through the heart with their swords. The poor wife, almost dead with terror, was unable for some time to find words wherewith to thank her brothers for this timely rescue. As Bluebeard left no heirs, his wife inherited all his immense fortune. She bestowed part of it as a marriage dower on her sister Anne, who was shortly after married to a young nobleman who had long loved her. Some money she spent in buying castles and lands for her brothers. With what remained she was still vastly rich, and she was soon married to a generous-minded young man, a companion in arms and friend of her brothers, and his love and courteous treatment soon made her forget the cruel usage she had received from Bluebeard. "I give you the keys," said he on their marriage day, "that open everything I possess, and all the secret chambers of my heart. You may look in all and where you will, and you will find nothing that I desire to hide from you, for you will find nothing anywhere but love for you." "And I," answered his wife, "will never allow myself henceforth to peep and peer into what does not concern me." Author's note: Bluebeard. One of Perrault's admirable tales. It has been supposed that the story was based on the crimes and execution of the infamous de Retz, but I do not think that there is evidence that this was the case. Fatal curiosity occurs in several folk tales. End of section 16.
Section 17 of a Book of Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Book of Fairy Tales by Sabine Baring-Gould. The Fair Maid with Golden Locks. As it fell upon a time, there lived in Golden Land a beautiful princess, whose hair was like the finest gold, and waved and rippled down her back, and reached the ground, and she was called the Fair Maid with Golden Locks. She always wore a crown of China roses on her head, and dresses of the softest and palest pink, or blue, or white, embroidered over with diamonds, so that wherever she went, and whenever she moved, she twinkled like a laburnum bush covered with dew on a May morning. Now it fell out at this very time that there was a certain king, and as he had heard so much of the Fair Maid with Golden Locks, he sent an embassy to Golden Land to ask her hand. The ambassador arrived in Golden Land with his message, but the princess refused the king's offer. She said she was over young to marry yet. Then the ambassador set off sadly on his way home. When he arrived in the city where the king was waiting impatiently for him, everyone was much disappointed because he returned alone, for everyone had expected he would have brought with him the Fair Maid with Golden Locks to be their queen. Now there was at the court a young man who was very clever and very handsome. His name was Charming. Most people liked him, and he was a favorite with the king, but for that very reason several of the courtiers were envious and sought his destruction. One day Charming said without consideration that if he had been sent to Golden Land, he would not have returned with a refusal. This was quite enough for his enemies. They at once went to the king and said, "Charming has been talking in a very insolent manner. He says he is such a good-looking fellow that Princess Goldenlocks would never have refused him." When the king heard this, he was inflamed with rage, and gave immediate orders that Charming should be thrown into prison, and fed with only one slice of bread without butter on it, and plain water every day, till he grew old and grey and ugly. So the guards seized on Charming and carried him away to the dungeon. There he lay for many days on straw, and ate only the piece of dry bread, and drank only the pipkin of water allowed him. One day he said sadly to himself, "How is it that I have offended the king? I am his most faithful servant, and have done nothing against him." The king chanced to be walking by the tower when he said this, and he overheard the words of Charming. The enemies of the young man tried to make him walk on, and disregard what he had heard, but the king insisted on Charming being brought before him. The young man was released, and bending on one knee, he kissed the king's hand, and asked how he had offended. "You made a mock of me and my ambassador," said the king, "and you declared that if you had been sent, you would not have returned without the fair maid with golden locks." "No more would I," answered Charming. "I would have made such a description of your majesty that the princess would have been all impatience to jump into your majesty's arms." The king now saw that Charming had been evil and falsely spoken of. He took the young man back into his favour, and said to him, "So be it. You shall go on an embassy to Golden Land, and if you return without the princess, I will cut off your head." Charming said he was content to run the risk. The king desired to give him a fine equipage and many servants and heralds to blow trumpets before him, but Charming said that all he wanted was a good horse, and to take with him his little dog Dulcet. So next day he started at early dawn, and rode all alone, save that his little dog Dulcet ran beside him. Charming carried with him a notebook, and whenever a happy thought struck him which could go into his description of the king he was going to give to the fair maid with golden locks, he got off his horse, sat down, and wrote it, for fear of forgetting it. He wrote, "My master the king is a very great lord. His stomach is round, and his shoulders are broad." "That goes splendidly," said Charming, and he rode on a little way. Then a new idea struck him. He got off his horse, and wrote, "His temper is high, but his mind it is low. He croaks when he talks, like a carrion crow." Then he got on his horse again. After a while he thought of some more words in commendation of the king, so he got off and wrote, "His great moustaches they twist and twirl, to win the heart of each right-minded girl." Once, as he was sitting by the water, trying to find a rhyme to bandy legs, and sorely troubled because he could not make a suitable line ending in eggs, a little golden carp that was rising after a fly sprang out of the water and fell in the grass beside him, and remained panting, unable to return to its proper element. "Poor little fish," said Charming. He put his hand down, took the carp, and threw it back into the water. The carp was delighted to be again in the refreshing coolness of the water. She swam up to the bank and said, "Thank you, Charming, for what you have done. You have saved my life, and when you need my help, I will give it to you." Another day, as Charming was riding along, he saw a raven in great distress. It was pursued by an eagle that would have devoured it, had not the young man quickly discharged an arrow from his bow and killed the eagle. The raven, perched on a tree, nodded its head and said, "Thank you, Charming, for what you have done. You have saved my life, and when you need my help, I will give it to you." Night came on, and Charming rode through a wood. The moon shone as clear as the day, and painted the ground silver where it pierced between the branches and leaves. Presently Charming saw what seemed to him a great lump of snow, but it was making a great noise. He went up to it and found that it was a white owl caught in a gin. Charming at once released the poor bird, and the owl hopped onto a branch and said, "To who?" "Do you ask to whom you owe your release?" "To me, Charming," answered the young man. "You should speak good grammar, and say to whom, and not to who." "Thank you, Charming," said the owl, "for what you have done. You have saved my life, and when you need my help, I will give it to you." These were the only 3 adventures of any importance that befell Charming on his way to Golden Land. When he arrived at the palace of the princess, he saw how magnificent it was. Pearls seemed to be as plenty as pebbles, and diamonds as common as dust. He thought to himself, "If the princess consents to leave all this and come with me to marry my master, I shall be much surprised. And yet his great moustaches they twist and twirl to win the heart of each right-minded girl." When he appeared before the princess, his little dog Dulcet would come in with him. He was so well dressed and so handsome that the guards saluted him respectfully, and a messenger was sent to the princess to announce the arrival of another ambassador. The princess was vexed. However, she consented that he should be allowed an audience. Then Charming approached her throne, bearing himself modestly and showing the profoundest respect. When he looked up, he was so struck with her beauty that he put his hand over his eyes as though dazzled. She was in one of her most beautiful dresses, and was covered with rosebuds. Then she graciously bade Charming approach, so he kneeled on one knee and gave her an eloquent description of his lord and master. "My master the king is a very great lord. His stomach is round, and his shoulders are broad. His temper is high, but his manners are low. He croaks when he talks like a carrion crow. His great moustaches they twist and twirl to win the heart of each right-minded girl. He has a nose in the midst of his face, and a couple of ears in their proper place. His eyes are round, and his mouth is wide. What more would have an exacting bride?" "That will do," said the princess. "You are so amiable and so eloquent that I would gladly oblige you and marry such a beautiful and interesting king. But I must tell you that I have promised not to marry till I receive a ring which I lost a month ago. I was walking by the riverside when I chanced to draw off my glove. In doing so, I slipped a very valuable ring off my finger, and it fell into the water. I cannot think of listening to any proposal of marriage till that ring has been restored to me." Charming was much surprised at this declaration. He bowed, and begged the fair maid with golden locks at least to accept the little dog Dulcet he had brought with him. She replied that she did not want any presents, and dismissed him. All night long Charming tossed on his bed and lamented. "How am I to find the ring that fell into the river a month ago?" said he. "It is not possible. I shall lose my head." Dulcet heard him, and said, "My dear master, do not despair. Let us at all events try what we can do. We will go down tomorrow morning to the riverside and peer into the water." Charming thought this absurd. He gave the dog an impatient slap. At first glimmer of dawn, Dulcet began to frisk about, and insisted on making his master come out with him and walk by the riverside, and there they wandered up and down, but could see no ring in the water. Charming had almost made up his mind to return to his lodgings when he heard his name called. He looked about, but saw no one. Then he walked on, but again heard a voice that called, "Charming, Charming." "Who calls me?" he asked. Dulcet, who was very small and ran close to the water's edge, cried out, "Master, I see a golden carp coming." And sure enough, there was a carp, and it said to the young man, "You saved my life in the meadow where grew the poplar trees, and I promised to repay you. Take this, it is the ring of the fair maid with golden locks." Charming took the ring out of the carp's mouth with many thanks, and he and little Dulcet, which gambolled and barked about him, returned to the palace. Someone told the princess that he was asking to see her. "Ah, poor fellow," said she, "he desires to say good-bye." Then Charming entered, and making a profound bow, approached. He gracefully bent his knee, and handing her the ring, said, "Madam, I have done your bidding. Here is what you had lost. Now will you marry my master, who is the greatest king and most attractive man in the world. His great moustaches they twist and twirl to win the heart of each right-minded girl. He has a nose in the midst of his face and a couple of ears." "Enough," said the princess. "I have heard that already, and would really be moved to accept the king by the eloquence of your speech and the melodiousness of your lines, but that I am determined not to marry anyone so long as I am pestered with the addresses of an ogre named Galifron, who eats human beings as a monkey eats chestnuts. Before I can listen to your proposal, you must kill Galifron and bring me his head." Charming bowed profoundly and said, "Madam, I can at least die in your cause." This was said so gracefully that the princess was moved with pity, and said all she could do to dissuade Charming from attempting to fight the giant. But it was of no use, and he went forth, obtained suitable armour, and mounting his horse, rode in the direction of Galifron. Everyone he met told him what a terrible ogre Galifron was, and nobody dared go with him as a guide. However, Dulcet frisked at his side and said, "Dear master, whilst you are aiming at the monster's breast, I will bite his shins, and when he stoops, you can deal blows at his head." Charming praised the little dog's plan, but had no great opinion of its success. At last he drew near to the ogre's castle, and saw that all the ground about it was strewn with bones. Presently he heard Galifron coming. His head was taller than the highest tree. As he came on, he roared like a bull. "I gobble them up, both old and young, garoo, garoo, garoo. If old and tough, they are better hung, garoo, garoo, garoo. If young, at once I snap off the head, garoo, garoo, garoo. I'm never happy but when full fed, and now I will dine on you." Charming, with great spirit, answered him, "Don't count your chickens before they are hatched, nor sell your pullets before they are catched. There's many a slip 'twixt the cup and the lip, and to catch a sparrow you'll even fail, till a pinch of salt is dropped on its tail." The grammar was not perfect. Charming ought not to have said catched, which was vulgar, but caught would not rhyme with hatched. Besides, he was too frightened to be in a truly poetic mood. Galifron was very furious, and he roared and rushed at Charming, swinging his iron club, and would certainly have killed him had not at one and the same moment Dulcet flown at his shins and bitten them, and a raven darted down out of the rock and pecked at the giant's eyes, and beat his face with its great black wings. Consequently, his blows fell harmlessly upon the air, and Charming, rushing in, gave him strokes on his knees, which brought him to the ground, and then, standing over him, he hacked off his head. Then the raven croaked out, "You see I have not forgotten the kindness you once showed me. Today I have fulfilled the promise I made to repay you." Charming thanked the raven with all his heart, and then, mounting his horse, he rode away with the giant's head at his saddle bow. On reaching the capital, the people came out in crowds and welcomed him and shouted with joy, and the church bells rang out merry peals. The princess asked the meaning of this, and was told that Charming had killed Gallifron and was returning unhurt, bearing his head. Charming now requested an audience, and the fair maid with golden locks could not refuse it. He entered with many bows, and kneeling at the foot of the throne, put down the ogre's head at her feet. "Madam," said he, "I have accomplished the task you set me, and now let me hear that you will listen to the suit of the most accomplished and powerful of kings. My master the king is a very great lord. His stomach is round, and his shoulders are broad. His temper is high, but his manners are low. He croaks when he speaks." "That will do," interrupted the princess. "I have no doubt that the king is all you have depicted him in your resounding verse. But I have, you must learn, the greatest horror of growing old and ugly. Therefore I have determined most decisively never to marry till I can take with me a phial of the water of perpetual beauty. This water has the most marvelous properties. Beautiful things never decay and wither, and ugly things become beautiful when washed with it. If anyone is young, he never wears old if washed with it, and one who is old can be renovated with it to look perfectly young." "Princess," said Charming, "you at least need never employ this water, but I am an ambassador who must do all I can to obtain your hand for my master. Will it please you to tell me where this water is to be found?" "It is at no great distance from this," said the princess. "It flows out of the rock at the bottom of a deep and gloomy cavern, and is guarded by 2 dragons with fiery eyes, who will allow no one to pass them." "Madam," said Charming, "I fly to my death. My death will be sweet, because dying for you." When Charming had departed, the fair maid with golden locks said to her ladies, "Surely he will never undertake this adventure. I would not have him die for worlds. I only said it because I really have no heart to marry his master." She was extremely concerned when she heard that he was already departed in quest of the water of perpetual beauty. Charming went on his way, taking Dulcet alone with him. When he came within sight of a great black mountain, then he knew he was not far distant from the fountain. He dismounted and turned off his horse to graze, and let Dulcet amuse himself with catching flies. He went forward and soon saw the mouth of the cavern, from which issued puffs of smoke with flames. This was caused by the breathing of the dragons who guarded the fountain of the water of perpetual beauty. He approached as near as he dared, and saw the hideous monsters spotted black on yellow, writhing about the coils of their slimy and monstrous bodies. Charming had brought with him a flask. He now drew his sword, and resolved to penetrate into the cavern and get the water, or die in the attempt. At that moment he heard a voice calling, "Charming, Charming!" "Who calls me?" asked he, looking round. Who, who, was the answer. "Exactly what I want to know," said Charming. Then he saw a white owl sitting among the rocks. The white owl said to him, "You saved my life when I was in the gin. Now I will do all I can to repay you. Trust me with the phial. I can thread the interstices of the rocks and penetrate to the bottom of the gloomy cavern, and shall fill the flask from the fountain of perpetual beauty for you." Charming was only too glad to give up the phial, and the owl flitted with it into the cavern without either of the dragons caring to stop her, even if they noticed her, for bats and owls were the common inhabitants of such places. Presently she returned with the phial filled with the limpid and sparkling liquid. Charming thanked her with all his heart, and joyfully hastened back to the capital town. He went straight to the palace and presented it to the princess. She could not now make any further excuses, and she prepared to go with Charming to marry his master the king. But, in her heart, she would much rather have had Charming as her husband. At last they reached the king's great city, and he came out to meet the princess, and escorted her to his palace with a great retinue, and a magnificent marriage was celebrated. Then the fair maid with golden locks told the king of all that Charming had done, how he had recovered her ring that had been lost, how that he had slain the ogre, and how that he had obtained for her the water of perpetual beauty. Now Charming's enemies were jealous of him because he had succeeded so well, and especially the ambassador who had failed was so filled with envy and spite that he resolved on Charming's destruction. So he went to the king and said, "I suppose that the fair one with golden locks is often talking to you of Charming." "Certainly she is," answered the king. "It is very clear," said he, "that she thinks more of him than of you." "Yes," said another, "and Charming has been saying that your majesty was too great a coward to face the ogre, or to get into the cavern where were the dragons, and too stupid to find the ring, and so you sent him." "Did he say that?" exclaimed the king. "Throw him into the lowest dungeon." So they took Charming, who had served his master so faithfully, and shut him up in prison. And he had none with him save his little dog Dulcet, and with the dog he shared his bit of bread and sup of water, which was all the nourishment that was allowed him. When the fair queen with golden locks heard what had been done, she cast herself at the king's feet and implored him to set Charming free, but the more she entreated, the more stubborn he became. Now it happened that the king took it into his head that if his queen washed herself with the water of perpetual beauty, he might just as well do the same himself, and then he would always remain young and lovely. So he went into her room, where he knew the phial was standing on a shelf. It had fallen out, however, that one of the queen's maids had been chasing a spider in that boudoir, and in trying to kill it, had upset and broken it and spilled all the precious water. Not knowing what else to do, as she was not an honest girl who had the courage to speak the truth and tell what she had done, she swept the bits of broken glass together, and then remembering that there was a phial very similar in the king's room, also filled with clear water, she went there, and without saying a word to anyone, took this and put it on the shelf in the queen's room, precisely where had stood the flask that contained the water of perpetual beauty. Now the water in this bottle was used by the king for getting rid of those people in his realm whom he desired to destroy without a fuss and a trial. It was a most deadly poison, and if a face were bathed in this water, he who was thus washed shriveled up and died on the spot. The king went into the queen's boudoir, and seeing the phial on the shelf, immediately took it, poured out some of the water into the hollow of his hand, and bathed his face with it. He at once fell down, withered up, and was dead. There was, as may well be guessed, great confusion in the palace when the tidings spread that the king was dead. Dulcet ran to the queen, plucked at her skirts, and bade her not forget Charming. So she sent for the jailer and bade him immediately knock the chains off the hands and feet of the prisoner. There was a grand funeral for the king, and then, as there was no heir to the kingdom, and the nobles and council thought it would be well to keep the two kingdoms united, they resolved that the fair queen with golden locks should reign over both, and that she should choose a husband who should be king over both the realms. When she heard this, then she said that she would not choose anyone else but Charming. Everybody was delighted that he should be sovereign, and the wedding, which took place after a decent interval for mourning over the death of the king, was as splendid as can well be imagined. Notes: The Fair Maid with Golden Locks. This capital story is by Madame D'Aulnoy, but is not wholly original. She has made use of the favorite tale of the thankful beasts and the story of the tasks, and has welded the two happily together. The tasks are introduced into Cupid and Psyche. End of section 17. Recording by Jeff Cahill.
Section 18 of A Book of Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. A Book of Fairy Tales by Sabine Baring-Gould. Jack the Giant Killer. In the days of King Arthur there lived in Cornwall a lad named Jack, who loved to hear the wonderful deeds done by King Arthur and the knights of his Round Table, which were greatly noised abroad. Jack did not see why he himself should not achieve as great adventures as Sir Launcelot du Lac, Sir Gawain, or Sir Kay. At this time there lived many giants in Cornwall. Not far from Jack's father's house, on the top of St. Michael's Mount, lived one who was the terror of the neighbourhood. His name was Cormoran, and he had a voracious appetite. When he required food, he came down from his castle, and seizing on the flocks and herds of the poor people, would cast an ox over his shoulder, and stuff his wallet with sheep, and stride back to his dwelling thus supplied. This had been his manner of life for many years, and the country round Mounts Bay was nearly ruined through him. After Cormoran had stuffed himself well with meat, he usually remained at home for a good many days, till his supply was exhausted. Jack took advantage of this circumstance, and one night he dug a deep pit before the gateway into the castle, and covered it with sticks and heather, and over that he laid sods of turf. When this was done he blew a loud blast with his horn, and this roused Cormoran from sleep. He issued from his castle in a great rage, and when he saw Jack he roared with a voice of thunder, "Who are you, that you dare to disturb me?" Then he charged from his gate with great strides, so as to catch Jack and kill him. But the very second step he took, he went headlong into the pitfall Jack had prepared for him. Jack at once ran to the side of the pit, and as the giant tried to scramble out, he aimed at him with his pickaxe, cleft his skull, and the ogre fell back dead. Jack now ran home in great glee to tell his friends what he had done. The whole country was moved at the news, and resolved to show to Jack some token of gratitude for having delivered it from such an encumbrance. They therefore presented him with a sword and belt, on which was written in pearls, "This is the valiant Cornishman, who slew the giant Cormoran," and they named him Jack the Giant Killer. But this only whetted Jack's desire to achieve fame and kill giants. The news of what he had done had reached the ears of another equally greedy giant, named Blunderbore, and he resolved on chastising Jack for having killed Cormoran. Jack heard of this, and he therefore resolved on being beforehand with Blunderbore, by attacking him before he got under way to punish him. The giant lived in a castle in the depths of a great forest. Jack started in quest of him, and shortly before reaching the castle, sat down to drink of a clear stream that sprang out of the rock, and as the day was warm, and Jack had walked a long way, he fell asleep. Whilst he was in this state, Blunderbore came to the spring to fill his pitcher, and seeing a youth lying there, he stopped and read what was written on his belt. "Ha, ha!" roared the giant, as he caught him up. "Now I have got you, and you shall not escape me." Jack awoke with a start to find himself in the grip of the giant. He pretended to be still asleep, and the giant carried him into his castle, and threw him into a dungeon. Whilst Jack lay there he heard many sighs and groans issuing from other prisons, and a voice which said, "Haste, gallant stranger, haste away, before you fall the giant's prey. He's gone abroad, but with another. He'll soon return, his savage brother. A monster dread and cruel who will torture ere he butchers you. Then, gallant stranger, haste away, ere you become the giant's prey." "That is all very good advice," said Jack, "but somewhat impracticable. When I am locked up in prison, how can I get away?" He crawled up into his window and looked out. Then he saw the giant Blunderbore, who had gone away, was returning with another giant more hideous than himself. Jack, perceiving in one corner of his dungeon a very stout cord, used for binding prisoners, he made a slip knot at each end, and as the giants walked under the castle walls, he threw the loops over their heads, pulled them tight, and tied the cord to his window bars. You may believe that the giants struggled, kicked, but the more they struggled, the tighter grew the slip knots, and at last they were quite choked and dead. He now pulled at that bar of his window to which the giants had been attached, and which they in their struggles had almost torn out of its socket. He easily slipped between it and the next bar, and finished the giants with his sword. Then, seizing the keys which hung from the belt of Blunderbore, he entered the castle and examined all the prisons. In one he found 3 ladies hung by the hair of their heads to nails, and almost starved to death. Jack at once released them, and asked how they came to be there. They informed him that the giant had killed their husbands, and then had hung them up as Jack had seen, that they might starve. Jack then very gallantly offered them the keys of the castle, and bade them live there. He then bade them farewell, and departed for Wales. Jack now travelled as fast as he could. At length he reached a handsome mansion, and knocked at the door. Then out came a Welsh giant. He was rather dismayed at this, but did not allow the giant to see it. He said he was a traveller who had lost his way, and that he sought a night's lodging. Thereat the giant welcomed him and escorted him in, and gave him a room with a good bed in it. Jack undressed and went to bed, but could not sleep, although he was very weary. Presently he heard the giant walking backwards and forwards in the next room, muttering to himself, "Though here you lodge with me this night, you shall not see the morning light, for with my club I will kill you quite." "Oh, is that your intention?" thought Jack. "I must see if my wits will help me." Then he got out of bed and put a great log of wood in his place, and concealed himself in a corner. About midnight the giant entered the room, and with his cudgel struck several heavy blows on the bed, and the very place where Jack had laid the log. After that, thinking he had killed the sleeper, he stumped back to his own room. Early in the morning Jack put a bold face on the matter, and walked downstairs and found the giant at breakfast, and very much surprised the ogre was at seeing him. "Hullo," said he, "you here? How did you sleep last night?" "Pretty well," answered Jack. "I should have slept better had not a rat given me 3 or 4 slaps with its tail." This speech mightily surprised the giant, but he said nothing. He then brought out 2 huge bowls of hasty pudding, one of which he set before Jack, and the other he took himself. Jack, instead of eating his, contrived to pour it down his neck into a leather bag which hung before him. When they had finished, Jack said, "Now I can do what you cannot. I can run a knife in here," pointing to his bag, "without killing myself." He then seized the knife, plunged it into the leathern bag, and out fell the pudding. The giant was surprised at this, and not liking to be outdone in such a matter, he also seized the knife, plunged it into his body, and died on the spot. Now Jack ransacked his house, and found in it 4 great treasures: a cloak which would make those who wore it invisible, a cap of knowledge which when put on told one all one desired to know, a sword of sharpness that would cut through anything it touched, and shoes of fleetness which when worn made the wearer run like the wind. Jack now took these 4 treasures and went on his way. He travelled over high hills and moors, and came to a forest whence he heard cries issue. He went in their direction, and saw a giant dragging along a knight and his lady by the hair of their heads. Jack alighted off his horse, tied him to an oak tree, then he put on his invisible cloak, under which he carried the sword of sharpness. When he came up to the giant he made several strokes at him, but could not reach his body, but wounded his legs in many places, and he continued hacking till he had cut through the leg bones, and then down tumbled the giant, when he at once ran his sword of sharpness into his body and killed him. The knight and his lady thanked Jack for their deliverance, and invited him to their castle. "No," said Jack, "I cannot be satisfied until I have found out the habitation of this monster." So he remounted his horse and rode away, and in time came to a mountain. When he drew near he saw bones lying about, and knew that he was close to the dwelling of a giant. So he put on his invisible cloak and ascended the mountain till he reached a cave, at the door of which sat a giant, who was saying, "I wonder where my brother can be. He promised to bring a good fat knight and a plump lady for our day's meal." The giant was a hideous monster, with eyes as fierce as those of a wild boar. He had shaggy cheeks and a long beard, the hairs of which were like wire. Jack walked up to him and aimed a blow with his sword, which cut off the giant's nose. He jumped up yelling, and looked about him, but he could not see his adversary. Jack now sprang on the giant's seat, and aimed at his back, and pierced him through, so that he uttered a groan and died. Jack then cut off his head, and sent it along with that of his brother to King Arthur. Having thus slain these two monsters, Jack entered the cavern, and passed through several chambers in succession, till he reached one in which was a boiling cauldron, and a table ready set for the giants to eat their meal on it. He now heard doleful cries of captives, and following the sound came to a cavern all round the walls of which were cages, in which a number of persons were kept. When they saw him, they cried out, "Are you also come to be put in a cage and fattened for food?" Jack replied, "Fear nothing, I am come to release you all. I have killed the two giants, and have sent their heads to King Arthur." The poor prisoners shouted with joy when they heard this. They had expected only death. Jack now undid the doors of their cages, and let them out. Jack next went to the treasure cave of the giants, and found there many bags full of money. This he divided equally among the captives he had released, and then bade them all return to their homes. Jack now went to the castle of the knight and his lady whom he had delivered, and was received with great joy. The knight made a great feast for Jack, and at the conclusion presented him with a ring, in which was a picture of his deliverance of him and the lady from the giant, and these lines beneath: "Behold, in dire distress were we, under a giant's fierce command, but there obtained our liberty, by valiant Jack's victorious hand." Hardly had the ring been presented, and the guests had applauded, before into the hall rushed a messenger to say that Hundel, a savage giant with two heads, having heard of the death of his brethren, was coming full of fury, and with great strides to take revenge. This news put a stop to all mirth, and a shudder ran through the company. Jack, nothing daunted, drew his sword of sharpness, and said, "Let him come. Let the guests assemble on the battlements of the castle, and see how I will deal with this fellow." To this they all agreed. Now round the castle was a moat that was very deep, and was crossed by a drawbridge to the gates. Jack ordered this drawbridge to be lowered, and set some men to saw the beams nearly through. Then putting on his invisible cloak, and taking his sword, he went against the giant, who was turning his noses, for he had two, in every direction, and was snuffing the breeze and saying, "Fee, fo, fum, I smell the blood of an Englishman. Whether he be alive or whether he be dead, I'll grind his bones to make my bread." When Jack heard this, he said, "You must catch me first." "Where are you?" asked the giant, looking about. Then Jack threw off his cloak of invisibility, and put on his shoes of swiftness, and ran. The giant came pounding after him, making the earth shake under his tramp. Jack made him run after him 3 times round the castle, that the guests might have a good sight of the monster. Then with a sudden dart he crossed the drawbridge, and ran in at the gate. The giant at once pursued him, but no sooner was he in the middle of the bridge, than the beams that had been nearly sawn through gave way, and he fell headlong into the moat. Jack then ordered a strong rope to be brought him, and he cast nooses around the giants' heads, and by the aid of horses drew him up to the edge of the moat, and then cut off his 2 heads. All the spectators rejoiced, and praised Jack for his great cleverness and courage. He remained 2 or 3 days with his host, and then set off in search of fresh adventures. He travelled over hill and dale unmolested till he reached the foot of a great mountain, where he saw a little hut, at the door of which he knocked. The door opened, and a venerable old man with a snow-white beard stood there. Jack respectfully asked if he might be sheltered for the night. The old man was a hermit, and he invited him in, and set before him some bread and fruit. Whilst he was eating, the hermit said, "I perceive that you are the brave Cornishman who has destroyed so many giants. Now on the top of this mountain is an enchanted castle, kept by a giant called Galligant, who by the help of a vile magician gets many knights and ladies into his castle, where he changes them into owls, ravens, bats, and other noxious birds and animals. I lament above all the fate of a duke's daughter, whom they seized whilst walking in her father's garden, and they have turned her into a deer. Many knights have tried to destroy the enchantment and deliver her, yet none have been able to do so, because of 2 fiery dragons that guard the entrance to the castle. But you have got the cloak of invisibility, and can pass by them unperceived. On the gates of the castle you will find engraved some words that will tell you how you may break the enchantment. Jack promised that, in the morning, at the risk of his life, he would attempt this adventure. Accordingly, next day, he put on the cloak of invisibility, and descended the mountainside. He saw the 2 dragons, but because of his mantle they could not see him, and he passed between them unmolested. On the castle gate hung a golden trumpet, and under it was written these lines: "Whoever can this trumpet blow will cause the giant's overthrow." As soon as Jack had read this, he seized the trumpet, and blew such a shrill blast that the gates burst open, and the walls of the castle trembled. The giant and magician now knew that their evil course was at an end, and they stood biting their thumbs and shaking with fear. Jack, with his sword of sharpness, soon killed the giant, but it was a less easy matter to subdue the magician, for he turned himself into various shapes. Jack did not know what had become of him. Until the magician was overcome, those who had been transformed by him could not be released. But he put on his cap of wisdom, and at once discovered that the magician had changed himself into a little ant, and was creeping away between his feet. He immediately raised his foot to stamp on him, when the magician became a hare and fled like an arrow. Jack put on his shoes of fleetness and went after him, when all at once the magician changed into a knot of thread. Jack knew him, because he had on his cap of wisdom, so with his sword of sharpness he cut the knot, and the magician was dead. Then all the knights and ladies who had been transformed into noxious birds resumed their proper forms, as did also the duke's daughter, who thanked Jack on her knees for her deliverance. The head of the giant Galligant was sent to King Arthur, who invited Jack to his court, made him Knight of the Round Table, and gave him to wife the daughter of the duke whom he had delivered. Notes: Jack the Giant Killer. This is a genuine old English chapbook tale, and is to be compared with others in other languages, where a man of small stature, by his adroitness and superior wits, overcomes men larger and more powerful than himself. It is probably a reminiscence of a struggle between 2 races, the one small and the other of greater bulk. End of section 18.
Section 19 of A Book of Fairy Tales. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michaelides. A Book of Fairy Tales by Sabine Baring-Gould. The 3 Bears. It happened that on a time there lived in a wood 3 bears, and of these one was a great big bear, the second was a middle-sized bear, and the third was a wee bear. Each slept in his own bed, and naturally so, for the great big bear there was a great big bed, and also, quite naturally, for the middle-sized bear there was a middle-sized bed. And you can see for yourself, if you have common intelligence, for the wee bear there was provided a wee bed. But that was not all. Each had his own chair to sit in, and naturally so, for the great big bear there was a great big chair, and also, quite naturally, for the middle-sized bear there was a middle-sized chair, and also, in accordance with the dictates of common sense, for the wee bear there was provided a wee chair. That does not complete what has to be told. There goes more to the story than that. Each bear had a pot out of which to eat his porridge, and the great big bear had a great big pot. And also, in accordance with the eternal fitness of things, the middle-sized bear had a middle-sized pot, and there was for the wee bear only a wee pot. One day after they had poured out their porridge, they scalded their tongues with it. That is to say, the great big bear scalded his great long tongue, and the middle-sized bear scolded his medium tongue, and the wee bear scolded his weeny tongue. So they resolved to walk out arm in arm into the wood and listen to the whistling of the birds whilst their porridge cooled. Now, whilst they were out, a little girl came into the cottage, and seeing that there was good porridge smoking on the table, and no one there to eat it, she tripped in, as she was very hungry. And first she tasted the porridge of the great big bear, and found it so hot that she burnt her mouth. So she went to the second pot and tasted them, and then also after having taken a little, she thrust the pot from her, as it was too cold. Lastly, she went to the pot of the wee bear, and that was just right, so she ate it all up. Then the little maiden, having satisfied her hunger, felt tired with her walk, so she went to sit down, and first she sat in the chair of the great big bear, but she found it was too hard for her. She did not like it, so she got up and tried the chair of the middle-sized bear, and that she thought too soft, so she quickly jumped up out of that, and tried the chair of the wee bear, and that was exactly right, neither too hard nor too soft, and she sat in it till she sat through the seat and came plump on the ground. Then the little maiden went upstairs into the bedchamber in which the three bears slept. And first she lay down on the bed of the great big bear, but it was too high at the head for her. So she got off it and tried next the bed of the middle-sized bear, and found it was too low in the head for her. So she got off that and went to the bed of the wee bear, and that was exactly right. She had no sooner laid her head on the pillow than she dropped asleep. By this time the three bears had heard enough of the whistling of the birds, and they thought that their porridge would be cool enough, so they came home to breakfast. Now the little girl had been careless and had left the spoon standing in the pot of the great big bear, so he roared out lustily, "Somebody has been at my porridge!" And then the middle-sized bear looked at his, and saw that the spoon was standing in that also, so he exclaimed with a growl, "Somebody has been at my porridge!" Then the wee bear looked at his, and found that his porridge was all gone, and the spoon licked clean also, so he said, "Somebody has been at my porridge, and has eaten it all up." Upon this the three bears, seeing that someone had invaded their house whilst out together, arm in arm, looking at buttercups and hearing the birds whistle, began to peer about, and very soon the great big bear roared out at the top of his voice, "Somebody has been sitting in my chair!" For the little girl had not arranged the cushions after having sat on the chair. Then the middle-sized bear exclaimed with a growl, "Somebody has been sitting in my chair!" For the cushions there also were all in disorder. But the wee bear soon saw that the seat of his chair was sat through, so he whimpered out, "Somebody has been sitting in my chair, and has sat the bottom through." Then the three bears thought it requisite to make further search, and they walked upstairs, majores priores, as the classic Romans would have said, that is to say, biggest first. Now, when the great big bear came to his bed, he saw that the pillow had been pushed on one side, so he booed out, "Somebody has been in my bed!" And the middle-sized bear saw that the pillow in his had been pushed up into one lump, so he said, "Somebody has been in my bed!" But the wee bear standing by his bed was so astonished that at first he could say nothing at all. At last he piped out, "Somebody has been in my bed, and is lying in it now." The little maid had heard the bellowing of the great big bear, but had been so fast asleep that the sound had not woke her, and she had heard the middle voice of the middle-sized bear, and that also had not woke her. She was so very sleepy. But when she heard the sharp little squeaky voice of the wee bear, she jumped up at once, and there she saw the three bears before her, glowering at her as if they wanted to eat her, and licking their lips and stretching out their claws. She was a little miss of a ready wit, so she turned to the first and made a profound curtsy down to the very ground, and said with the greatest deference, "Mr. Bear, I pray you forbear." And she made a nice little graceful curtsy to the second, and said with a pitiful voice, "Mr. Bear, I pray you forbear." And then sharp she gave a little bob of a bow to the wee bear, and caught him a wee box on his wee ear, and said, "Little Berrykins, I don't care whether you forbear or not. and away down the stairs and out at the door, and away, to her mammy home she ran. Then the 3 bears looked at each other, and the first said, "Dear," and the second said, "Dear," and the third, rubbing his ears, said, "Dear," and altogether concluded that little girls of the 19th century were so impudent that it was no longer possible for well-conducted bears to live in the forests of Old England. Notes: The 3 Bears, a tale by Southey. End of section 19. Recording by Michaelides.